So now I'm going to talk about our speaker, who is called Michael Marshall. Many people call him Marsh. And he's best described as a skeptical activist, which basically means he questions the veracity of claims that lack scientific evidence. He's also the editor of the Skeptic magazine. He writes for the Times, the Guardian, the New Statesman. He's the co-founder and vice president of the Merseyside Skeptic Society and co-host of its official podcast, which is called Skeptics with a K. And if you listen to them, they are very interesting and always entertaining. He's the project director of the Good Thinking Society, a non-profit organisation promoting scientific skepticism, established 12 years ago by the redoubtable Simon Singh. He is also a fellow of the Committee of Skeptical Inquiry, which is part of a US non-profit that seeks to promote scientific inquiry, critical investigation, and the use of reason in examining controversial and extraordinary claims. This is music to our ears as humanists. And being a fellow of CSI is actually quite a big deal. Other fellows have included Nobel laureates, notable scientists, philosophers, psychologists, and other luminaries. Now, I first met Marsh for the first time in October this year at the totally brilliant QED weekend conference in Manchester. It's fantastic. It's all about conspiracy theories and science proving people wrong. Fantastic and entertaining speakers, including Marsh, a weekend celebrating science, reason, and critical thinking. And please, somebody come with me next year. The people who go are just delightful. So, over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody for coming out and for having me come down to speak. Simon's done a great job of explaining who it is that I am. These are the various things that I'm involved in. Simon's mentioned that I work as a full-time skeptical activist and investigator for the Good Thinking Society, which means it's my full-time job to understand where are people selling misleading claims, whether it's about health, whether it's about conspiracy theories, whether it's people who say they can talk to the dead. Where are those people? What harm are they doing, and what can I do to try and prevent that harm from taking place? So if you see headlines, you may have seen some headlines a few years ago about how the NHS was spending taxpayer money on homeopathic remedies, even though the NHS admitted that they don't work. You may have seen headlines that the NHS stopped doing that, and it was actually my work that stopped them doing that. I first investigated, found out how much money was being spent, and then helped the NHS, the doctors in the NHS, get rid of that. So it's kind of one of the things that I do in my day job. And then another part of my day job is to travel around the country and occasionally around the world, giving talks about the various things that I've encountered along the way, to try and encourage people to be critical thinkers and to get out and engage with the world around them. Which means it's part of my day job to encourage groups of strangers to doubt stuff. Whenever I tell everybody that that's my day job, there's always someone in the audience who looks at me as if to say, that isn't a job, is it? And to that person, I would say, that's how good I am at making you doubt stuff, that you even doubt the veracity of my chosen career. But I have got a podcast called Skepticism, but I've also got another podcast called Be Reasonable, which is where I interview people who have ideas, who hold on to beliefs that I would disagree with, but rather than being antagonistic and aggressive or dismissive and patronising, I try to actually ask them what it is they think and why do they think that, and try to have a conversation so I can understand as much as possible, because I think it's very useful to first understand what it is that we're up against if we're then going to do anything about it. I think people change their minds more readily if they feel that there's a conversation happening than if they're under attack. And it's actually this latter podcast that got me into the subject that I'll be talking about today. Because you may have seen headlines several years ago now, maybe 6-7 years ago, there were headlines about people across the world who are starting to believe that the world was flat. And there was a documentary on Netflix, there was this chap here in the BBC, there were people on ITV's This Morning interviewed about how they really believe the world is flat. And this is about 2016. But I actually came across the Flat Earth movement in, I think, 2012, first of all, on my podcast, Be Reasonable, where I came across the fact that there was a podcast from the Flat Earth Society in which they interviewed someone who believes the world is hollow. And I thought, that is a conversation I need to hear. That sounds like a fascinating conversation because these are two fundamentally incompatible worldviews. And what I found from listening to it was they barely disagreed at all during the course of the conversation. Because what they did was agree that everyone else was wrong. And that was the important thing. So the fundamental incompatibilities of their worldviews just didn't come up. So I got quite interested in the flat earth movement. I've met lots of flat earthers. I've interviewed lots of flat earthers. And I think I've got a good handle on how this world works. And so it's worth going back at the history of the flat earth movement, or the modern flat earth movement. And it's actually a history that's quite relevant to this building, in fact, because it was 1838. You have this chap here. This is Samuel Rawbotham, who's variously described as a con artist and a creationist. And some people may think that's an overlapping Venn diagram with quite a large overlap. The degree to which Rawbotham believed in his creationist ideas and his various other ideas, he sold all sorts of snake oils and various things. The degree to which he believed is kind of up for dispute, up for conversation. But what he did was tap into a movement of people who were against the Darwinian idea, this newfangled Darwinism idea of evolution, to say, actually, no, evolution can't possibly be right because the Bible is inherently correct. And we can know that's true by looking at what the Bible says about the shape of the earth, about having four corners and things, and then conducting scientific experiments that demonstrate the world is actually flat. And their point was, if we can show that the world is flat, all these people who believe the world is round have to be wrong, the Bible has to be true, and therefore we can throw away Darwinism as well. And so in 1838, he conducted this experiment called the Bedford Level Experiment, where he went to a canal, he had a friend in a rowboat, row 6 miles away from him, and he calculated that according to the curvature calculations of what the round world should say, once his friend gets to 6 miles, there should be 6 miles of curvature between them, and his friend should disappear, and he shouldn't be able to see them. And then yet what he found was if he looked through a telescope, he could still see his friend. And that was enough for him to say, this is absolute proof. Now, lots of people have subsequently repeated that experiment, and if you do it correctly, you can't see the person because they do disappear behind the horizon. But the degree to which Samuel Rawbotham did the experiment correctly and the degree to which he was one of those con artists who was selling snake oil at the time, this is all kind of important context as to why he said this experiment definitely worked. But he did convince a lot of people. One of the people he convinced was a guy called John Hampden, who was a relatively rich guy at the time who kept repeating these experiments. He was a strong champion of Rawbotham's, and he actually engaged in a wager, quite an aggressive long-term wager, with Alfred Russel Wallace. To repeat this Bedford level experiment, and said, I'll bet you a huge amount of money. And he actually lost that wager to Wallace. He actually first claimed that he'd won it, and Wallace was about to pay up when it was revealed that Hampden had cheated and was cheating his way out of this bet. And this started a long-running feud between the two men. And Russel Wallace, I'm sure you know, was Darwin's bulldog. He was one of the other people who really pushed forwards the idea of evolution at the time. And this was a long-running feud that eventually sort of followed both men to the grave. It was really Hampden, starting off as a very wealthy man, ended up in a debtor's prison because he'd disgraced himself with how many times he was caught libeling Russel Wallace and was having to fork over money. But this didn't dissuade Rawbotham. He kind of sat in the back seat during these long-running disputes. But then in 1881, he wrote this pamphlet called, under the pen name Parallax, which is called Zetetic Astronomy, Earth Not a Globe. The Earth is not a globe. You can see here's a front picture of that pamphlet. I have actually tried to acquire a first edition of this pamphlet. It wasn't very expensive, but they're very rare. I'd love to get my hands on. This is like a foundational document of the modern flat Earth movement. But in this pamphlet, he puts together all of his proofs about the world being flat and all of the ideas he's come up with that demonstrate the world is flat. And when he died in 1884, there was a local aristocrat or a very wealthy woman who put her family fortune, Lady Elizabeth Blount, put her family fortune into starting the Universal Zetetic Society, what was essentially the modern flat earth movement, the precursor to the flat earth movement, which was a society dedicated to spreading the truth of the flat earth. And she was a very fascinating character. There's really interesting books written about her that I haven't got time to go into, but she was a really interesting character. Arguably, she was looking for an escape, a level of escapism from a marriage she wasn't particularly happy in, and wrote all sorts of fantastic romance novels. I think she wrote a romance opera at one point, and it's terrible, but it really shows her kind of imagination at the time. But she sank a lot of her time and money into the Universal Zetetic Society. And it was this society that, towards the start of the 20th century, had really sort of gained quite a few members, but it started to tail off in the early decades of the 20th century. And essentially, the more mankind was able to get up in aeroplanes and eventually leave the Earth, the fewer people believed the world was flat, because more people had evidence that they could see a level of curvature beyond what the human eye can see at sea level. And then in 1956, you have here, this is Samuel Shenton. He formed what was called the Flat Earth Society. He formed it in Britain. He was also a creationist. And he founded it based on the principles of Robotham, to try and breathe new life back into these ideas of Robotham. In 71, he died, and this chap here, Charles K. Johnson, an evangelical pastor and creationist, transplanted that society over to America, called it the Flat Earth Research Society of America. And actually, there was a tragedy. I think it was, in the 1990s, the membership dwindled to essentially double digits or fewer, because Charles K. Johnson's house caught fire, and he had the membership books of all of the members' names and addresses in the house, and they were lost to the fire. So the society kind of dwindled away, literally into ashes again. And then in 2004, the Flat Earth Society was reformed in the UK by a chap called Daniel Shenton. That's not his real name. For a while, I thought it was the most remarkable coincidence that there was a Shenton. The only two Shentons I could find in all of recorded history were both flat earthers. That, to me, was the most remarkable part of the story. I've subsequently learned he just took the name Shenton as a tribute to Samuel Shenton. So it's a bit of a shame that's taken that coincidence out. And then in 2013, this is where I came across the Flat Earth Society, when they were having this conversation with hollow earthers, a hollow earther I would actually later go on to interview, and I can tell you about him perhaps in the Q&A. And again, I found this whole conversation fascinating, because it allowed me to hear what they talk about when they're talking to each other, which is not what they say to people who think the world is round. Because when you are someone who knows the shape of the earth and you talk to a flat earther, they will throw out all of the things that they want to say in order to persuade you. But that isn't necessarily what persuaded them or what they talk about when they're talking to one another. It's why I spend a lot of my time undercover gathering information, because I think people talk a lot more honestly about what they believe when they're talking to people they agree with, rather than the arguments they put forth to deter enemies of their ideology. So a few things that I found out from this conversation. Firstly, I found out there was this schism in the Flat Earth movement about what shape the world was. Half of the membership, or a percentage of the membership, thought this kind of traditional model here, with the disk version of the Earth, where you've got the Arctic Circle in the centre, you've got the continents splayed out around the edges, and then right at the very edge, this is the wall of ice that we would all call Antarctica. Antarctica is instead a wall of ice that is a discrete ring around the disk version of the Earth. But that was only what some flat earthers thought, because the other half of this schism believed that, yes, there was this Arctic Circle in the middle and the country spread out, but instead of there being a discrete wall of ice, instead the ice just went on infinitely in all directions. And the term they used was that the world is an infinite plane that bisects reality. That there is the above the plane and the below the plane, and then the Earth just bisects what is above and below, and there's no way of getting beyond the edge. And I love the idea of an infinite plane that bisects reality. That was a charming idea to come across. And this allows them to add other things to their worldview. Because essentially, if we're all beings stood on land in the puddle, this great puddle in the centre of this ice plane, well, if we're in a puddle, perhaps somewhere over there's another puddle. Perhaps in that puddle there's land, and perhaps on that land there are beings, and that's where aliens come from. So if you're a flat earther who believes in alien visitations, that might not work with this model, where your universe doesn't look the same way, but you can make it work in this, because here we are, but maybe the little green men are coming from here or here or here, and they can find their way over. And what I found was they were sort of magpie-like, picking up other ideas, and instead of when they found a conflict with an idea they already held, they just mashed the two together and came up with something like this. So I thought that was quite fascinating. The other schism that I found really interesting in the Flat Earth movement were between the people who wholeheartedly believed the world was definitely flat, and those who kind of knew for a fact it wasn't, but enjoyed the intellectual pursuit of arguing something they knew to be false, to see how esoteric and unusual can you be with your proofs of the flat earth. They were just having fun. They were intellectual trolls, probably reasonably well grounded in science, who were just coming across this and thinking this was a lovely bit of fun to come up with all these remarkable ideas about remarkable proofs of the flat earth. The problem is, this group of people who were just mucking about were really good at it, and they really persuaded this group of people who believed it to believe even harder. And so there was this kind of inbuilt mechanism towards a recruitment, an inculcation into this idea. And so the schism was kind of was formed, but that schism was less of an argument and more of a drive towards a depth of belief. But the other thing I found that I thought was genuinely fascinating was the Flat Earth Society at the time was a forum where they would discuss their ideas, and people would bring up these esoteric proofs that they've come up with, and people would debate them and discuss them and see why they disagreed and things. And there was quite a lot of conversation going on in those forums, but there was also conversation with people who didn't believe the world was flat, who are coming in to correct all these foolish people who think the world is flat. Aren't they ridiculous? Aren't they stupid? I'm better than that. I know the world is round. I can school them. I can tell them how stupid their ideas were. And the problem is this group of people who were rushing into the forum to correct the flat earthers hadn't really spent any time thinking about how they know the world is round. They just knew it because it's a widely accepted fact, and they figured if anybody doesn't accept that, they must be stupid, therefore I can beat them in any argument. And what they missed was the people they were arguing with spent all their time thinking about why the world was flat. So if you rush into that conversation having never witnessed what's going on, what arguments they have, just knowing that, well, I'm right, I'm representing the science, and you've never thought about it before, you're going to bring up the first things you can think of that show the world is round. And if they're the first things you can think of, they're probably the first things they thought of, and they're still flat earthers. So they have an answer to that. It's probably not a very good answer, but if you've never heard it before, you're not going to be very good at figuring out why it's not a good answer. So the skeptics who were trying to rush in and show these flat earthers how wrong they were, and in quite an arrogant fashion to correct them, were rushing into these conversations, having not understood at all the arguments and conversations that were already happening there, having come across these ideas for the first time and being flummoxed by them, but also finding this cohort of intellectual trolls who were very, very good at rebuffing the skeptics because they knew all the skeptics' side of things because they also didn't think the world was flat. So the people who were mucking about would have fun deflecting the people who were trying to correct everyone, and they would have such fun and be so effective at it that the people who believed the world was flat, who really believed it, were getting further into that belief. And it was really interesting. So one of the things that would come up that the people who were trying to correct the flat earthers would say, well, what about gravity? Gravity is a major issue. If you don't have a central mass with a center of gravity, how do you explain for things dropping towards the ground? Well, the flat earthers would say, what is gravity? Well, gravity is an accelerating force downwards. You drop something, it accelerates towards the ground at like 21 point, I forget what I used to know the exact, I've done this talk a lot of times, I've forgotten the exact speed, the acceleration of gravity. Anyone know the acceleration of gravity? You can shout it out if you do. Sorry? I was almost there. Okay, yeah, 22 feet per second. So yeah, when you drop something, it accelerates towards the ground at that speed. They said that is indistinguishable from a world in which you let go of something and the ground rises up to meet it at the speed of gravity. So how do we know which one of those is happening? Maybe it's not that the objects drop towards the ground. Maybe the ground is accelerating upwards and has been since the dawn of time, but it's accelerating at a steady rate, and that's why the math of that works back out. And people hadn't thought about this, and they were sort of flummoxed. But of course, if something is accelerating since the dawn of time, there's going to be another issue that's going to arise. Anyone want to shout out the issue of constant acceleration since the dawn of time? Speed of light, absolutely. You can't go faster than the speed of light. So the skeptics who were there to show that the world was actually flat would say, well, your constant acceleration doesn't work because you're going to exceed the speed of light. That's impossible. You're wrong. You're an idiot. And the flat earthers, especially this group who knew what they were doing, would say, well, if you look at Einstein's theory of relativity, it says as you get faster, as you approach light speed, time itself starts to slow down in a dilation effect. So yes, the world is accelerating upwards, but as it does so, time is starting to slow down again, and that just keeps that rate of acceleration relative to us the same all the way, and the math of that works. And people were completely flummoxed by this, and they would lose those arguments. And so we were now in a version of the world that the flat earthers are putting forward, where the flat earth is an infinite plane that bisects reality in all directions and is accelerating upwards at the speed of gravity and has been since the dawn of time, getting closer and closer to light speed. But the people who were coming in to show that the world was round had no real knowledge of that happening until they got there and lost those arguments. So I thought there's a really fascinating illustration of how skeptics, and people who are trying to be critical thinkers, when we don't listen to the arguments that we're going to reject or going to rebuff before we try and argue with somebody, we can lose not because we don't know the science, but because we don't know the pseudoscience. It's important for us to know what the false claims are and why they're false before we engage in those conversations. So I thought that was a fascinating kind of grip on things, but that was actually quite a complex thing as well. That was so while this was recruiting people to the Flat Earth movement, it also had a limitation, because very few people are going to wander in and start being flat earthers because they understood that Einstein's theory of relativity showed that it's possible to approach light speed with time slowing down. That wasn't going to, you couldn't stick it on the side of a sticker on and try to recruit people on the street. That's not going to bring many people to the movement. So that isn't why the movement really started to take off in 2015, 2016. It kind of had a self-limiting factor as to the people who were going to listen to those kind of arguments. Other people would be rebuffed by the complexity of the math and things, or the physics and things. But when it came to like 2015, 2016, we did see internationally this rush towards, from certain sections of society, towards the Flat Earth movement. And I think I can put my finger on why that happened. And one of the things that caused it was a publication of this. This is a YouTube video that was released as an ebook. This is Eric Dubay's 200 Proofs. Eric Dubay is also a creationist. That creationism is just threaded through the history of Flat Earth right up until the modern Flat Earth movement. It really, really is. And so this was released in 2016, this ebook, this YouTube video, 200 Proofs the World is Flat. And we've had 2 centuries on from Samuel Rowbotham, essentially, almost 2 centuries on from those Samuel Rowbotham arguments in 1838. And yet, these arguments are not 2 centuries more developed or 2 centuries more complex. They don't show a more complex worldview. They are the same arguments. So, number one reason is the horizon looks flat. When I stand somewhere and I look out to the horizon, it looks flat to the naked eye, and you can't tell me my naked eye is wrong. How can you tell me that the thing I'm sensing with my own senses, how could you tell me the information I'm gathering is wrong? I can just look out and common sense tells me that looks flat. They talk about water a lot, that you can't get water to go uphill, and you can't get water to stick in a sort of curved, beyond surface tension, stick in a curved shape. So if you had a glass of water or a bowl of water, if you filled that with water, the water would eventually lie flat. If you had a bathtub and even if you mushed it about a lot so it was very swishy, eventually it would fall and the surface of the water would go completely flat to the naked eye. And so they would argue, therefore, that it's impossible for water to have a curved surface, so how would the oceans possibly still stay on a flat Earth, on a round Earth? The water would just run off, and that's impossible, they would say. They said, yeah, rivers always run downhill. This was one of theirs. Rivers always go downhill, but if the world was curved, some of those rivers here would have to go uphill to get to the sea. That was the argument. But this is one of these arguments. This is a really every flat earther I've ever talked to cites this book as one of the pivotal moments of becoming a flat earther. They say, what about pilots? Talk to pilots. If you think about a curved Earth like this, a pilot, as they're flying, would have to keep course correcting the nose of the plane down to stop them flying straight off into space. So they'd have to every now and again sort of point down a little bit to stay in a parabolic flight across the Earth. And he said, and this argument is that if you talk to pilots, there's never a point where they have to kind of do this in the plane to stop them flying off into space. And this was an argument that people would make, and I've had this argument made to me many times. So these are fundamentally not engaging with the science of the spherical Earth at all, but rejecting it based on premises that seem simplistic, but actually just aren't fitting to the model of the world that we're in. And they say cannonballs. If you imagine that the world is spinning from west to... if you imagine that the world is spinning and you fire a cannonball north to south, what would happen, according to the flat earther, is the cannonball would leave the cannon and then the world would spin away from it and the cannonball would go in a straight line. And from our perspective, given that the world is spinning like 6,000 meters a second or something like that, we would actually witness the cannonball leave the cannon and fly off to one side as we spin away from it and it flies in a true line. And they argue that's not what happens when we do this. We can throw things in a straight line without it shooting off to one side. Or we can get in a helicopter. One of the arguments is if the world is really spinning, you could get in a helicopter, and to go anywhere, you could just lift up and let the world spin under you, and then just land back down when the bit of land that you want to get to comes to meet you. It's a very simplistic, very silly argument, but this was very persuasive to a lot of people who got into the Flat Earth movement. The argument here, this is literally 29 of the 200. If the Earth was actually spinning, we'd feel it. Because when you're in a car and the car's going like 60 miles an hour, you can feel that you're moving. Well, if the Earth is traveling even faster than that, we should feel it even more so. We should really feel it. And I will come back to these arguments later. Genuinely, 113 in this influential book is, if Australia is really upside down, people would fall off. People would know that they were upside down. There's pictures of like, well, if you're looking at Paris from space, then the Eiffel Tower would be sticking out to the side. So why wouldn't people feel that they're sticking out to the side and they're not like directly straight up because they're not on top of the Earth? These are very, very silly arguments, but they're made completely po-facedly in this book that really does believe them, and people believed it. And here we have 189. The Bible says the earth is flat and always unmoving. And I think this is the real key to it. All of the others are just ways of persuading people that actually the reason I think the world is flat is because my Bible tells me so, my religion tells me so, and therefore all these other things are just ways that I'll persuade other people to believe it. But it's not why I believe it. I believe it because of faith, because of a religious position first and foremost. And 191 is, well, you know, Pythagoras and Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and Neil Armstrong, they were all Freemasons. So, you know, literally as far as the argument goes. So rumour mongering and conspiracizing and nothing more than that. But this was a hugely, hugely influential book and influential video, and I think that one of the two touch papers on the modern flat earth movement when it caught light in 2016. The other one being this chap here. This was the chap who was interviewed in that BBC news article that I showed at the start there. This is Mark Sargent. Mark Sargent was going into the flat earth movement. He was a conspiracist who believed all manner of things. So he believed that JFK was assassinated by a member of the US government, that was an inside job, the grassy knoll. He believed that the moon landing was faked and that there was a civilization that lived on Mars and that carved a face into a mountain on Mars. And he believed all of these things. But he came across videos about the flat earth, which I think were probably Eric Dubay's video, and he thought that was silly. He said, this is obviously nonsense. I can debunk this. I'm smarter than this. I can prove it all false. And he said he spent 6 months trying to prove it false, and he failed. He couldn't prove it false. And he said, well, because I can't disprove it, I have to accept this as true. And that's why he became a flat earther. Now, I would say there are some things that I come across that aren't true, but maybe I'm not the best person at figuring out whether they're true or not. I'd have some intellectual humility and turn to experts. But the flat earth movement isn't like that. The flat earth movement is all about what you can demonstrate for yourself, either through your own senses or from logic from first principle, essentially. So because he couldn't disprove these things he was saying, he had to accept that it was definitely true. And so he produced this series of videos, Flat Earth Clues, in 2015. So it probably wasn't Eric Dubay, actually, that inspired him in. But this Flat Earth Clues series of videos was hugely, hugely influential. Those are the twin movements on YouTube that got people into the Flat Earth. And once those videos were on YouTube, people would start watching them, partly because some people were interested and curious as to whether it be true. Other people thought it was ridiculous and start watching them. Others were scientists who were scrutinizing the arguments in order to develop counter-arguments. But YouTube didn't care why you were watching it. It just saw that a lot of people were watching this video. And so maybe I'll start recommending this to people because YouTube just wanted to keep you on YouTube because that's where the adverts were. So YouTube started to recommend these videos, push these videos into people's recommendations. And once you've watched one that YouTube recommends, YouTube thinks, oh, you seem to like that because I recommended you a video and you watched it. I'll give you another one of those. This is clearly what you like. These are the kind of things that you like. And YouTube was training people to become flat earthers by feeding them the material from Eric Dubay and Mark Sargent and the people who picked up on them. And it wasn't doing it deliberately. It didn't care what the content was. It was just trying to keep people on the platform. But anyway, I interviewed Mark Sargent in 2017 to ask him about the flat earth. He told me a few things. So he did believe in the shape of the earth. I asked him about the shape of the earth. Which of these do you believe? The disk, the infinite plane? He said he believed the disk, but he went one further and believed actually that while there is a disk version of the earth, it was actually under a dome. So there's a roof on top of the world. It's like a snow globe, essentially. He said it's like in the film The Truman Show. If you've seen the Jim Carrey film The Truman Show. And he said that's not actually a coincidence. He said the people who run Hollywood know the shape of the earth and want to hide that from people, so they put it in films like this. So if anybody starts to suspect that we do live under a massive dome, people could dismiss that as, oh, you've seen too many Hollywood films. So the people who run Hollywood are the ones who are hiding the truth of the shape of the world. And if the people who run Hollywood sounds like a euphemism, I promise you we'll get to what that euphemism definitely means later in the talk. So I asked him, so tell me a little bit about how you think the flat earth worked. Tell me about the history. I wanted to understand what he thinks. And he said, well, the thing is, if you go back to the 1960s, you had the Cold War, you had America, you had Russia, they were facing off, they were posturing, they were showing themselves to be the superior power. And one of the things they were doing was looking for resources of minerals and resources of wealth in order to increase their power, and also places where they could put a military base that would increase their military power on the world. And eventually they both turned to Antarctica. And he said what happened was America, Russia, they got to Antarctica, and that's where the soldiers who got there, the military who got there, found the wall. They bumped into the bottom of the dome. They came hard against it. And at the point that they both realized that there was a dome there, the Cold War was over in the 1960s. They decided what we need to do now is hide the truth about the shape of the world and the dome from everybody else. So we'll just pretend to be at war for another 30 years or so. But realistically, we're allies against the rest of the world to hide the truth of the dome. If you were to ask him why, he wouldn't have a very good answer for that, other than, well, there's lots of money wrapped up in science departments who'd have to change their mind and change their views if we found out there was a dome, and they don't want you to know that. It's all kind of rumour mongering and things. But he does say he has proof. And the proof that he has that this dome is definitely there, he says, if you look at Werner von Braun, so Werner von Braun being the Nazi rocket scientist whose technology powered the V2 rockets that obviously hit the Blitz and things, after the Second World War, Werner von Braun was smuggled out of Germany into America and installed into the US space program so they could use that V2 rocket technology to power Americans into space, which is a real thing that happened. It sounds like a weird conspiracy, but I'm sure you'll know that that was a true thing. It was called Operation Paperclip. So Werner von Braun's technology powered the moon landing, powered the Apollo missions that got America to the moon. And yet, says Mark Sargent, that was all lies, and von Braun himself admitted it after he died, because the gravestone of Werner von Braun has a quote on it from the Bible, from Psalms 19:1, and the quote on this gravestone says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." Well, says Mark Sargent, the firmament is the biblical name for the roof on top of the earth. So here you have the man whose technology powered us to the apparent moon landing admitting from beyond the grave that it never happened because you can't get to the moon because there is a lid on top of the earth. That's his explanation of what that reference to Psalms means on von Braun's gravestone. I would argue the reference is much more about the heavens declaring the glory of God for a guy who saw his technology as the key to the heavens. The reason that mankind even got to the heavens to look down on the earth was through his technology, and the firmament being the stars and the universe that we can see from up there. But no, it's either that or it's a beyond the grave confessional from a Nazi scientist who was persuaded by the evil cabal to hide the truth of the world. Could be either. So I asked Mark Sargent, well, tell me about the rest of you talking about the universe and things. What do you make of the rest of the universe? There are stars, there are planets, there is the sun and moon. He said, well, the stars and planets, they're not real. Because what it is now that there's a dome on top of the earth, that's just like being in a giant planetarium, where it looks like the lights you can see are miles and miles away, but that's just a trick of an optical illusion. So either the stars and the planets that we see are projections on the dome, but they're definitely not out there, or they're even paintings on the dome, and there's just like a moving surface on the dome where things are painted on. And the sun and moon, they're just light sources that are moving around independently behind. And I said, okay, if the sun and moon were moving around behind the dome, how are they moving? What's the mechanism for them moving? He said, well, that's the questions they don't let you ask, because they don't even let you accept the truth of the flat earth. But if the universities accepted the truth of the flat earth, we could finally get to ask the big questions like who's moving the sun and who's moving the moon. So I thought this was interesting. I did actually ask him, because one of the questions I like to kind of ask people is like, when it comes to conspiracy theories, all these different things fit together in a way that doesn't make sense. I mean, he believed in all these different conspiracy theories. How do they fit together? Isn't it unusual that the moon landing was faked and JFK was killed and there was a face on Mars and all this stuff? Isn't it surprising that all those things happen to be true? What's the chances of each one of those being true? So I said, is there any conspiracy theory you've ever come across that you used to believe in and now you no longer believe that it's true? That you think, actually, that can't possibly be true, that was unreasonable. He said, yes, there is one. Because he said, I used to wonder, how are these things all true? But then I realised that they killed JFK because we'd have to fake the moon landing because you can't get to the moon because there's a lid on top of the Earth. So once he found flat Earth, it was like a Rosetta Stone of all these other conspiracy theories. He could make sense of them. That obviously you're going to have to kill Kennedy because he didn't know the world was flat. He was trying to get us to the moon, but you can't get to the moon. It's impossible. So all of that made sense. But he said, the one thing I don't agree with anymore, I don't think there was ever a civilization on Mars, and I don't think there was ever a face carved onto a mountain on Mars. And I want to find the person who came up with that idea, he said, and I want to interview them, I want to debate them, because I think they must be part of something that can't be true, because there isn't a civilization on Mars. I said, right, but that's because you don't believe in Mars anymore. That's not more reasonable. That's not because you've come away from a conspiracy theory because it was unreasonable. You've just got more unreasonable on it. But Mark Sargent was for a long time hugely prolific and hugely influential figure in the Flat Earth movement. This is taken from his website, The Enclosed World Domes. This his basic version. It's not a literal version, but this is kind of how he thinks the world works. Although he has, on his own website, got stars beyond the dome, so maybe he's not quite sure of his version. So we've got lots of different versions of the world. This was a version I didn't mention that Michael Wilmore, who was the vice president of the Flat Earth Society, he put forward as a way of explaining how the world is flat, but ships can still move around in the patterns that we know they can move around in. So this was his version that he says works better for shipping lanes. So they are trying to figure out different versions of the world. But while it's still happening, it wasn't all just happening on YouTube. So Mark Sargent was incredibly influential on YouTube, as was Eric Dubay. And it was so influential that it started spilling beyond the internet into public meetings. So this is a guy from the Chester Flat Earth Society on the streets of Liverpool, which is where I first came across him. He's there with his microphone shouting about, that was in Chester, but I saw him in the streets of Liverpool talking about how the world was flat. You can see his picture here, Research Flat Earth, 200 proofs. So he's bringing Eric Dubay's proofs to the streets. This is direct influence of that particular video. And if you're anything like me, when you see there is a Flat Earthers in the pub in Chester, and you live in Liverpool, which is not that far from Chester, of course you go and have a pint with some Flat Earthers, because why wouldn't you want to be in a room full of like 15, 20 people who think the world is flat? And I had a really fascinating conversation with them. I didn't tell them initially I was from a skeptics group, but I didn't lie about who I was. I just wanted to understand more about what they said. They took to me quite well, although they started to, eventually they cottoned on that I didn't believe, and it became quite a one-sided conversation where I was talking to about 6 of them at once as they brought up their different views. But some of the things they told me were really interesting. So first of all, they said the most important thing is never trust an experiment you haven't personally conducted. When people say CERN has found such and such, you don't know. You can't have a particle accelerator. They could be lying to you. Or any experiment you can't do yourself could be a lie. How do you know who to trust? You can only trust the experiments you've done for yourself. Anything else can be faked. As can any pictures. He said, there's a picture of like Nixon or someone or phoning an astronaut, and an astronaut's in space at the time, and it's ridiculous. Obviously, they've faked that. That can't be true. These are all fake pictures. He said, you can't trust any pictures. The pictures of the Earth from space, that's all a confection. That's all an artist rendering. That's a Photoshop job. There's all sorts of reasons why any of these images aren't true. So never trust an experiment you haven't done, and don't trust digital media because it can be manipulated in that way. But you can trust YouTube. In fact, here's some YouTube videos that are really, really important. In fact, one of the people at the pub got his phone out to show me an experiment that proved the world is flat, that he had a video of on YouTube. And I said, have you done this experiment yourself? He said, no, I haven't, but look, it proves the world is flat. I thought that's interesting, because what they're saying is, these are reasons I can dismiss your arguments, but I'm never going to train those reasons on my own arguments. Intellectual consistency is not what I'm going for here. It's defend at all costs the idea that I have, and attack at all costs the mainstream view. And when I reflected that back to him, that his own maxims could dismiss his evidence, he wasn't particularly happy. We also heard that gravity doesn't exist, so we'd heard about gravity, but his argument was gravity doesn't exist, instead there's only density. The reason you stick to the ground is that you are denser than air, that we're all incredibly dense, which I thought was a nice idea, that you put a dense liquid into a light liquid, and the dense liquid would fall to the bottom and the light liquid would go to the top. But I did ask them, what do you think the mechanism is for something dense falling towards the ground? Because the answer is gravity, so we're still coming back to gravity there. They brought up the idea that water always finds its level. It never bends, it never curves, it's always flat on top at all times. So these were the arguments that were coming up in the pub. But it wasn't just small meetings in the pub that were happening. There was actually a Flat Earth conference in Birmingham where 300 people, some flying in internationally, got together for an entire weekend in Birmingham to talk about why the world was flat. And if you're anything like me, obviously you bought a ticket to that, and you spent 3 days in a hotel with 300 flat earth. Oh, well, actually, it was 160 flat earthers. I'm exaggerating, having told this story too many times. I'm eliding the details. But yeah, 160 flat earthers for a 3-day weekend. Genuinely one of the most fun weekends I've ever had in my life. Long periods of complete boredom, punctuated by moments of like astonishing brilliance. Of like, I had no idea that someone could think that. That's amazing. It was run by a guy called Gary, who was he'd come to the flat earth movement in 2015, and I thought that was actually in itself quite interesting, because that's 3 years after I first came across the flat earth movement. I was in some ways the most experienced flat earther in that room in terms of the flat earth arguments. It was a very modern thing. This guy had gone from being an engineer in whatever field he was in to being not just a flat earther, but someone willing to put on a conference with his own money. In fact, he told me he lost money on the conference because he believed in it so passionately. So it became so core to his being that it became an event that he put on, and he did that very quickly. So this is 2015 he came to the movement. By 2018 we were at his conference. So something happened to really get this deep into people's identity, sense of self, quite quickly. I want to talk about some of the speakers that I saw there, because this was, I think, the most fascinating view of the flat earth movement. Actually, there was a lot of journalists present, and I actually wrote about this for The Guardian, but I went there undercover, and I stayed undercover with a friend of mine, because I wanted to be in conversations where people weren't trying to persuade a journalist in what they believe, but they were just trying to talk as if they'd talk to another flat earther about what they think. I thought that's a much more instructive conversation. But what I found really interesting is from the speakers, for the number of speakers that they had, not a lot of them would spend a lot of time talking about the flat earth. So this is Iru Landucci. So Iru Landucci is an Argentinian conspiracy theorist who believes in all manner of things. So he's been researching the New World Order for 13 years, 9/11 truther, anti-GMO, anti-vaccine, all sorts of things. Flat earther since 2014 on his channel, No Para Todos. I think it's now deleted because YouTube actually eventually got around to deleting the flat earth movement. Iru was kind of fascinating, not least because he flew in from Argentina, and when he got introduced by Gary, they just as a little bit of a light introduction, Gary mentioned about a little mishap that had happened, where Iru was meant to arrive on the Thursday, but then Gary got a phone call from Iru at the airport in Birmingham on Wednesday, and he'd arrived 24 hours early. And he said, and I had to drop everything, I had to rush to the airport to grab in. It was all quite silly. And they were just telling this as like a silly mishap. But I thought, yeah, I bet that happens all the time when your worldview can't account for the international dateline. Like, this kind of thing must happen all the time. You've got no excuse for that in the flat earth world. Each speaker had an hour-long slot. Iru went over his slot. He explained that the other mishap they had was he'd brought a 2-hour presentation for a 1-hour slot. So they agreed that he'd give his talk in 2 halves, on the Saturday morning and the Saturday afternoon. So on the Saturday morning, Iru gave his first half, and that was an hour and a half long. And the Saturday afternoon, he gave his second half, and that was 2 hours long. And on Sunday, he gave his third half, and that was another hour long. So he had a lot of material to get through, and yet not a lot of it was about the flat earth. Here he is on Argentinian television talking about the flat earth. But yeah, not a lot of it was about the flat earth. He talked about how, look at dinosaurs. You see pictures of dinosaurs. Obviously, they aren't real. They look like a cross between like lizards and giraffes and rhinos and alligators. And that's because when the New World Order commissioned an artist to invent dinosaurs, the artist drew on those animals as inspiration. So he said that that dinosaurs have like a familial relationship with those animals. And it's like, I think you've got this backwards. Like, yeah, they may have some kind of resemblance, but I think it worked in the other direction, Iru. But they have to deny the existence of dinosaurs because it's a creationist movement still. So you can't have the existence of something millions and millions of years ago because there wasn't millions of years ago according to this movement. He said atheists, he said if there's any atheists that you speak to, they think they're not worshipping a god. They are actually worshipping a god. They're worshipping Athos, the Greek mountain god. That the word atheist comes from Athos. So even people who don't realise, even the atheists who don't realise, are secretly worshipping Athos, the Greek mountain god. He liked to do lots of word games. It had a kind of a numerology, symbology kind of feel. If you could find a connection between two words, that connection had to be real and meaningful. To a point where actually he talked about the UN. The UN is a front for the one world order. And we know that for a fact, because if you look at the Spanish word for UN, it is the ONU. And if you take that backwards, that's UNO, which is Spanish for one. Therefore, the UN has to be a front for the one world order because the Spanish word for it, written backwards, is the same as one. I was there with a friend of mine. She leant over and said, does he realise that UN is French for one? Because it's if you pick a different language, you don't even have to reverse it, mate. You just, yeah. But he also said, if you want to know what's really happening with the world, we'll look at the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which shows you what the people who run the world really mean to do with the world, what they're really doing. Now, if you don't know about this book, this is a 2-3 century old anti-Semitic hoax. It was produced in Russia as a piece of anti-Jewish propaganda based on a sort of a bastardization, a plagiarism of a play about Machiavelli in hell. And it was purported to be the minutes of a meeting of the senior elderly Jewish people who control the world about what they want to do. And it was a lie. It was put out deliberately as anti-Semitic propaganda in Russia, as a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda has been. And then it was picked up in America, as a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda tends to be. It was picked up by Henry Ford in America, published in English, and disseminated that way. So this is a very well-known, hate-filled hoax document designed to, and very effective at provoking hoax, provoking hate against Jewish people for centuries. And yet here it is appearing at this Flat Earth conference, because somebody is withholding the truth of the world, and we have to get to an answer to that question if we have that worldview. As that was Iru. This is another speaker, Dave. Dave was English. He goes by the YouTube handle Allegedly Dave. Another interesting chap. He was a software engineer, a computer programmer who at one point worked on Wall Street. While he was there, he was also a volunteer fireman when 9/11 happened. He was living in New Jersey, so he didn't himself go into the towers, but he did know a lot of people that he lost along the way. And that was a very traumatic thing for him, for obviously America and the entire world, but he felt that he talks about how he felt that trauma quite acutely. Which is why in 2005 he became a 9/11 truther. So the only way to square what he was feeling about the trauma of the event was to say, well, actually, maybe this was an inside job. Maybe our lives aren't as kind of, I'm paraphrasing what I believe that those intents can be, but you can become a truther when you're so tied to something, because it can be, well, our lives can't be so easily ruled over and ended by an act of unexpected terror. It has to be all part of the plan. And so he became a 9/11 truther, believing this was all part of the plan. He also had what he described as a midlife crisis that led him to lead an off-the-grid lifestyle, which is kind of all sort of the prelude to him becoming a flat earther. And he also is somebody who, since May 2011, has been a proponent of urine therapy, which believes that you drink your own urine and wash in your own urine for all manner of health conditions. He says that urine reverses aging, is helpful with AIDS, with cancer, with smallpox, and in fact with this long, long list of other conditions. So urine is a great panacea. I only found out about his urine therapy after I shook his hand when I met him. I feel like that it's incumbent on you to tell people that before they shake your hand, but there we go. So Dave, he's a very influential UK flat earther. So he came to Flat Earth after seeing videos by Mark Sargent and Eric Dubé. So he saw those videos, started putting out his own material. He actually appeared on Macedonian television for a couple of hours, in fact, like an hour-long interview here, talking about the flat earth, and the Macedonian presenter was just not prepared for the arguments he was bringing forward, didn't know the pseudoscience, so very difficult to debunk it, and therefore anybody watching this could say, well, Dave did a really good job here, he showed that the world was flat. And actually a lot of people that I met saw Dave as a bit of celebrity in this movement. They were the reason he got into this movement, which I think is interesting, because like Mark Sargent, Eric Dubé were the reason Dave got into this movement, but then Dave rose to a prominence where he recruited other people in. So you have this kind of cascade effect of people being recruited into the movement. But lots of the points he was making in his interview were taken directly from 200 Proofs, which were Eric Dubé's video points, but those points themselves, a lot of them were taken directly from Samuel Rowbotham's pamphlet in 1870. Like literally, Eric Dubé uses the same diagrams that Samuel Rowbotham drew about how to prove that water finds its level and things. So it's the same arguments being recycled through creationists, essentially, throughout 2 centuries now. So here's one of the things that Dave showed during his talk. He wanted to be quite, he took a shot at the skeptics who try and prove the world isn't flat, the round earthers. This is a video from Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, who talks about how we know that the earth is round and the experiments that have proved that. One of the experiments is something called Eratosthenes' well. Eratosthenes was an ancient mathematician who had 2 wells, and he observed that at a certain point of the day, when you looked into one well, there was no shadow at all, the sun was directly above it, and then when you looked into a different well some distance away, there was a shadow, and you could calculate from the angle of that shadow where the sun was, and you can actually draw the lines back up and calculate that with 2 wells, either the sun is very far away and the world is curved, and it's the curvature causing the shadow, or it could be that the sun is very close and the earth is flat. But actually, if you add a third well, so these are the two versions of how this works. You see, if it's very far away, you can see the solar rays coming from up here would hit here, and this is where there is a shadow there, whereas there'd be no shadow there, or it's the nearby one. So you can't actually resolve this with just two wells. But if you added a third well, you'd get yourself an angle enough to kind of triangulate back more effectively. And in fact, with a third well, it only works with a faraway sun. It's not consistent with a nearby sun. So adding that third well proves that the world is round and disproves the flat earth. So Dave Murphy showed Neil deGrasse Tyson doing that video. He said, and this was a problem, but then I realized that this isn't true, that Neil deGrasse Tyson is deliberately lying to you, Dave Murphy said in his talk to the flat earthers. He said, this has to be a lie because, well, first of all, there wasn't a third well. They admitted themselves that Eratosthenes only had two wells, so this third well never existed. They've made that up. Now that you could throw the argument away based on that, or you could say there have been subsequent wells. There are more than two wells in the world. Does it work with three wells? It's not enough to throw it away because that third well is an addition if the maths of it works out with three wells. So you have to do the experiment properly and then get rid of it, or find out whether it's true. You can't just get rid of it on these flimsy grounds. But the other thing he said was he looked at this diagram from the video that we watched. And he said, this is actually a still from that Star Talk Neil deGrasse Tyson diagram. And he drew a straight line from the first well, and then he drew a straight line from the second well to the point where they intersect. That has to be the centre of the Earth at that point. Then he took this third well, the lie well, the fake well that was never there. He drew a line from that well, and it didn't match up in this diagram. That, he says, is proof that Neil deGrasse Tyson is deliberately lying to you because his evidence for the world being round itself doesn't match up. Now, you could do that. You could throw that argument out based on that disproof. Or you could say, that's a pretty bad cartoon. It's not a factually accurate scientific diagram. So could I draw this properly with scientific accuracy and then see whether Neil deGrasse Tyson's argument stands up? And if you do it properly, of course, it stands up. But the audience were howling with derision when he pointed out that this cartoon used to illustrate a point wasn't scientifically accurate. This was proof that the astrophysicists and big physics were lying to you about the shape of the Earth. So it's what I found was that the flat earthers were very willing to throw out the conventional arguments on the flimsiest of evidence, the flimsiest of arguments, but then not apply that same kind of rhetoric and interrogation to their own ideas. And then we have Darren Nesbitt. So he's the last one that I'll talk about before I kind of come to the concluding points. So Darren Nesbitt, again, UK guy, he was an interesting chap, conspiracy theorist, he was into all manner of things, the Illuminati, the Boston Marathon bombing was a hoax, 9/11 was an inside job, all this kind of stuff. He had a channel called Daz Nez. He was a folk singer about conspiracy theories. He had albums where he did conspiracy-tinged folk music, but I don't recommend it. I have listened to quite a lot of it. In 2015, he came out as a flat earther. In 2018, I actually interviewed him on Be Reasonable about him being a flat earther. This is him on ITV, this morning, when he sat there with Philip Schofield talking about how we know the Earth is actually flat, as part of the promotion for the Flat Earth Conference, in fact. Oddly enough, he's become a leader of the COVID denialist movement, which I'll come to in a moment. But actually, Darren Nesbitt's talk was really interesting because he opened it with some axioms he thought that were really important for us if we want to be good critical thinkers. He said, most importantly, be your own authority. Don't just take someone's word for anything. Don't accept something because someone's got a fancy job title. Be your own authority. And I thought, yeah, that's pretty good. You know, nullius in verbum is the medical slogan. Take nothing on reputation alone. That's a pretty good maxim. He also said, do evidence-based skeptical research. I was like, yeah, I'm very much on board with that, 100%. And he said, and he also shared this list that I thought was fascinating of questions that flat earthers should consider. They were like yes, no questions. And the list was things like, do you find it harder and harder to associate people who don't associate with people and socialize with people who don't accept the truth of the flat earth? And it was things like, do you find that most people's problems would be alleviated if they just recognize that the world was flat? Do you find that more and more of your thinking comes back to the flat earth all the time? Or when you're looking at something, the reasoning seems to be related to the flat earth? And you could see in the audience people like laughing and nodding and nudging each other because they recognized they were saying yes to these kind of questions. That's so many of these conversations they were having. Everybody they socialized with, they found it difficult to socialize with non-flat earthers. And then Darren Nesbitt said, this list of questions that I'm sharing with you is the questionnaire they ask people to ascertain whether they're in a cult or not. If you're saying yes to the answers, yes to these questions, these are signs you're in a cult. And I thought that is a fascinating thing for a flat earther to tell a flat earth audience, genuinely fascinating. And he did try and throw away some of them, like take shots at the flat earth models. For example, he said this model can't possibly be true. This one that lots of people accept, there are very basic, obvious proofs that this can't possibly be true. So he said there's a wall of ice around the edge. No one's ever seen it. Maybe 100 years ago that was a good enough argument, but these days, cameras and drones and airplanes and things, someone would have some evidence of this wall, and there's no evidence of it at all. So are they all silencing all those evidence, all those pictures, or does it not exist? He said, what about the distances in the south? If you travel across the south here, you've got to, well, actually, the best way to talk about it would be if I put this on. If you're trying to go from this line all the way around the world and back again, we know that if you to do this on the real Earth, the quickest ways to do that are around these two red lines. From here around the Arctic Circle, or if you travel around the real globe Earth, going around Antarctica is much quicker than trying to do it at this point, which is the equator. So the distances in the south should, on this model, be much longer, but they aren't. We know that they aren't. And actually, sailors have done this journey around the equator and found that that's the longest way to circumnavigate the globe. It doesn't work on a spherical model. This model can't work for it. What about stars? We know that if you're in the northern hemisphere, which is broadly speaking the bit inside the yellow circle here, you see one set of stars wherever you are in the north that you don't see in this outer circle. How would that possibly be true, he said? If this is all one disk and they're all looking at the same set of stars here, why is someone in Australia not able to see the same stars as someone in South Africa, but you can't see them if you're in Europe? This makes no sense unless there's something else going on. And he said there's never a point at which you have to turn back either. So you could carry on going this, if you could start in the centre here and go along this green line, you don't have to turn back when you get here. You could actually carry on past that. So this makes no sense. He said this model doesn't work for all sorts of reasons. So he proposed his own version that actually made a lot more sense. That this disk version is obviously untrue. Here's a version that makes a lot more sense. And what he said is he started by looking at the pyramids. He said the Great Pyramids are these miraculous wonders. He says that they're more aligned to true north than the Greenwich Observatory, which isn't true, but it does get said a lot about the pyramids if you Google it. But it's not a true thing. But he took that as his point for reasoning that the pyramids were the most important fact here. So he then started looking. He believes that if you look at a cross-section of the pyramids, he believes they're all built for their perfect geometry using pi and phi that they're using to represent this, because he measured some things and got some of them to equate to a rough approximation for pi. And he said, because I've managed to find pi in the pyramid, I started drawing circles on it to see if I could get circles to line up on the pyramid on this cross-section. And he drew this kind of thing here. And they said once he'd sort of managed to find enough circles he could fit on this cross-section of a pyramid, he reasoned that these are the pillars that the Bible says the world is built on. Because the Bible says the world is kind of built on pillars. Well, these circles must be representative of the pillars, with seven pillars in the centre, because God likes the number 7, he said. So therefore, he gave us a video of how this flat earth works on these 7 pillars that are rising up from his diagram of the pyramids. You've got 7 pillars there, and he's going to put on these pyramids his shape of the world, which he thinks works much better. And this is what shape he thinks the world is. This is actually his video that I'm showing you. So this is his model of the world. Rather than the disk model, he thinks this one's better. And do you know what? This isn't bad, because travelling across the northern point and the southern point is obviously going to be the quickest way to do that. Travelling across the equator is definitely going to be the longest way to do that, so that works pretty well there. If you look at this interrogate it carefully, you'll see some flaws with it. It's not a perfect model. There are some quibbles we might have. For example, you could just fall off the end here. That's a bit of an issue. But that's only if you believe that this is an edge. Darren Nesbitt doesn't believe there's an edge. He believes instead this is a 4-dimensional time-space warp, which means that if you travel from the centre off to the east here, instead of falling off the edge, travel off to the west, we'll say, instead of falling off the edge, you'll go through the 4-dimensional time-space warp and reappear in the east. So you can move forever. As we know, you can move forever. There's no, you don't have to ever turn around. The reason for that is this continuous movement, which I would describe as the Pac-Man model of the world. That you wacka, and you come back on this side here, and you can do that forever. But this isn't bad. But I said, actually, I can improve his model. We don't need these 4-dimensional time-space warps. If instead we took his diamond model and bent it backwards until this yellow bit met the yellow bit and the red bit met the red bit, and now we have an even better model which doesn't need us to do a 4-dimensional time-space warp. And in fact, if we took more than 3 points of measurement, but we actually measured here and here and here and here and here to see where it comes together, we'd slowly iterate ourselves back to a sphere. And so what I said when I was writing about this at the time was, Darren Nesbitt seems to be showing some level of inquiring mind on this, and maybe with time he can actually iterate himself back to a spherical model of the world. Unfortunately, he didn't do that. Instead, he became the leader of the COVID anti-vax movement. And so here is Darren Nesbitt speaking at a protest against COVID. Here he is in the BBC talking about, as they talk about the Light paper, which is one of the biggest conspiracist newspapers in the country. And I do an entire talk about this newspaper and the movement that it inspired. And I think it's no coincidence that Darren Nesbitt went from being a leading flat earther to being a leading COVID denialist and anti-vaxxer, and onwards from there into whatever the next panic is, because I think this is still a symptom of the fact that it's based on rejecting the reality, the mainstream version, rather than accepting an alternative version of the world, or putting forward a genuine alternative version. So I'm going to end with just some debunks of the argument, because I don't think I could end without sort of disabusing you of some of the arguments that they've put forth. So how do we know these models aren't true? Well, let's look at some of their explanations. They said the horizon always looks level. You can see this is one of the images they use to prove how flat the horizon is. And so you can say, just look at it. Here we are on a high mountain, looking at the horizon, it looks level. Well, the first thing I did was apply a ruler to their own picture. And what you see, even on their own picture, it's not level. There is a gap. It's very subtle. Obviously, this isn't enough to throw the argument out, but it is enough to try and explore it further. So how do we actually explain this? Well, if we look at the world, this is the spherical model of the Earth. It's 24,901 miles in circumference. We don't ever get to see the 25,000. But if we look at this as a circle, I'm just going to zoom in on this circle, because very few people ever have the privilege of seeing the world as this circle. Few of us even see this amount of the arc. And few of us even see this amount of the arc. I'm just zooming in on the same thing. And few of us even get to see this amount. But you see, even if I just take a zoom in at this point, you can see this looks an awful lot flatter now. And this is obviously all that's happening, is what we're able to see with our own eyes is such a narrow slice of the arc that at our local level, the curvature is so subtle. And I can see why people would dismiss it, because it's quite hard to argue that the thing you're looking at is not what it seems to be. But our brains just didn't evolve to handle the magnitude of the size of the Earth. We can't picture 25,000 miles as a sphere. Our brains evolved to deal with the things in our everyday life. And so this scale is just beyond what our minds can easily comprehend. But even just by zooming in on, this is the same circle I've just zoomed into, you can see it looks an awful lot flatter. And that's all we're really seeing with the flat Earth. What about that argument about cannonballs not flying off to the side and helicopters not being able to just lift up and wait for the ground to come underneath you? I think it's a really interesting argument. What they miss, obviously, is that when the helicopter leaves the ground, it was already spinning with the Earth. So the Earth spins at 1,000 miles an hour. That's the speed of it. When the helicopter's on the ground, it's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. When it lifts off the ground, it started at 1,000 miles an hour, and it's also going through an atmosphere that's spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. So it retains that momentum, and that's all that we're seeing. It's like being on a bus. You don't have to, if you want to throw something from the back of the bus to the front, you don't have to throw it faster than the bus is travelling, because you're all travelling at the same speed. The piece of paper only has to travel fast enough to get to the other end of the bus. You don't have to go like 70 miles an hour with your throw. And so actually there's a really interesting visualization of this, which is this trampoline that's being pulled by a tractor at 20 miles an hour. And this chap here is going to jump up and down on it. You can see there's walls to prevent the drag resistance, so they're not going to be hit with a great deal of wind resistance. And they're going to jump really high, even above these walls. And I've shown this video when I do a talk based on this to schools and ask kids, what do you think will happen when a person jumps up and down this trampoline when the trampoline's moving at 20 miles an hour? And our gut instinct says you're going to hit the trampoline and then you're going to fly at this back wall at 20 miles an hour because you're no longer in contact with anything that's moving at 20 miles an hour. But actually what really does happen is you fly in this perfect parabolic arc and can land exactly where you are, because when you leave the ground, you're starting at 20 miles an hour, you're going forwards. And I think that's a really interesting demonstration of that. But it's counterintuitive. To believe in that, to follow that, you have to engage with to understand what's happening there. You've got to engage with the real model of the spherical Earth and what's really happening, rather than the simplistic model that people have in their heads when they dismiss this stuff. And what about the behaviour of water? This idea that water won't curve, it won't curve around a bend, it doesn't go uphill. I think this is actually one of the memes that flat earthers use to show that if all rivers run to the sea, well, if there's land here, this river that's running to the sea on a curved earth, that's clearly going uphill, and this one's going uphill, whereas if you flatten the picture out, you'll see the river clearly runs downhill. And this is proof then that it must be flat and not a globe. But what this is missing, this is based on the assumption that gravity pulls down, regardless where you are, that there is some universal down to which gravity or density or whatever model you have is pulling you. So on a curved Earth, they think down would look like this. And if you apply these down arrows, you can see, yeah, this would look like it's going uphill. But this isn't what gravity is doing. It's not pulling you straight down. Gravity instead is pulling you towards the center. Here's the center of gravity. Wherever you are, it pulls you down at a local level towards the center. And if I apply these three exact arrows to their mean, it becomes really obvious that if down is here, this is not flowing uphill, it's flowing downhill. So they just have to engage with the model properly before they dismiss it. That's what science needs to be doing. You can't dismiss it based on a misunderstanding of the model. You need to understand the arguments you're dismissing before you dismiss them. And I think that's just as true of us when we come to the flat Earth models. Of course, you have the Bible. These are the diagrams that are put forth from the biblical versions. Well, this is actually a flat Earth diagram about how the world works in terms of heaven. So there you can see, here's the earth, there's the firmament, there's the water above, which is in Genesis, separate the water above from the water below. And above all of that, you've got God. And so these are inherently, the flat Earth movement is still creationist. It's in its design. It was there at the start, it remains. So what have I learned from spending several years hanging around flat earthers and spending time talking to flat earthers? I think I learned a few different things. Firstly, it's quite easy for us to talk about this in terms of science, that they're science deniers, that they reject science. I think it's not about science for them. They would love science to agree with them. They're constantly doing experiments to try and get things right. And unfortunately, those experiments aren't always very well conducted. But it's not about science. Science isn't what got them to be flat earthers. Instead, it's about identity and their value system and their rhetoric. So they first believe that they have the value that we can't trust the mainstream. And if you go into life with the idea that you can't trust the mainstream, you're going to start rejecting things that are true because your axiom of the mainstream can't be trusted is faulty at that point. It's also about identity. Someone can go from finding an idea on the internet in 2015 to running a conference about it in 2018. That's fitting something in their life. That's scratching an itch in their life. And to help people come away from that, we need to understand what box it's ticking. We can't just give them science to get them back out of it. YouTube had a massive, massive role in this. I've talked about this a lot, so I'm happy to do questions on this. But I think people wouldn't be flat earthers if it wasn't for YouTube. QAnon would not have become a massive conspiracy movement if it wasn't for YouTube and Facebook and the algorithms that try to keep you on the website for adverts. We can often talk about the flat earth belief as a flat earth, but I don't think there is. I think what I can demonstrate is there are many flat earths. There are different versions of the flat earth. And in fact, they don't have to... they can be fundamentally incompatible. Darren Nesbitt got up and showed that the disk version of the Earth is completely nonsense, can't possibly be true. And the audience applauded. And then the next speaker got up and showed how the disk version is something they agree with. And the audience applauded. And nobody said, the glass guy proved that isn't true. Because it's not about putting forth a version of the world that's true so much as it is showing why the main version, that everyone else is wrong. It doesn't matter what flavour of right you are as long as everyone else is wrong. I didn't even get to the cosmic egg. I could talk about the cosmic egg if anybody has a question in that area. It's a whole story in itself. And also flat Earth, while there isn't just one flat Earth itself isn't one belief. It's a cluster of other beliefs. It's biblical literalism, it's satanic paranoia, it's Illuminati, New World Order, anti-Semitism, anti-vaccine, alternative medicine, chemtrails, anti-fluoride. It accumulates ideas. And it's because it's not about accepting that the world is flat, it's about rejecting what everyone else thinks. And once you do that, it leaves you open to accepting all sorts of other things that aren't evidence-based. And a lot of people will end up at flat Earth because they got into it through a different movement and they just were hanging around flat Earthers. And if you're there because you believe 9/11 was an inside job and the ways that you judge that to be true aren't very robust, then people are going to start applying those, are going to start pointing your reasoning at other ideas, and you haven't got a robust way of rejecting those either. So people get recruited into these ideas. People also come at it for a lot of reasons. I mean, a lot of the speakers, I was kind of struck by how many of the speakers made a point in their talk at the Flat Earth Conference of mentioning that they were going through a hard time in their life, or they lost their job, or they had a health crisis, or someone in their life died, and they felt lost, and then they realized the world was flat. That's when they came to it. And so they were at a low point where life didn't feel like it was going well for them, and this came along and gave them answers to that. And I was given this talk, I've been given this talk since 2018. I was given this talk in 2018, 2019. I think this was incredibly relevant when the pandemic came along and people rejected it. Because when life when life wasn't making sense, people need something, they need agency, they need an external force they can point to. And in the course of the pandemic, an invisible virus wasn't a satisfying villain. And stay at home and do nothing wasn't a satisfying action to take when your livelihood was going down the pan. So people instead rejected the virus and thought the action we need to do is to stand up to the people saying that it's true. Because the alternative is to do nothing and watch your kind of life go badly. And I think this was happening a lot for people. People in times of crisis are at their most vulnerable to being pushed into bad ideas. And I think that's how we get people out. And I think ultimately, mockery helps a lot less than understanding. If we want to try and help people, and the reason I do what I do is I want to try and help people, the way we do that is to understand them, to hear them, to know what's influencing them, and then to see how we can help them back out of that. And if we do that compassionately enough, it is possible to help people out of the holes they find themselves in. I've probably gone a bit over time there, but thank you so much for listening. I hope that was all right. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you. I did go too long. I hope it's all right.
That was wonderful. Absolutely amazing. You could go on for hours. Absolutely amazing. So we're going to have a few questions now. Can I start with a question? You mentioned sort of intellectual trolls, people who join these conspiracy theories really just to stir up trouble. They don't really believe it, but they want to egg these on in the mischievous guys. How prevalent is that?
It's very hard to tell because sort of by definition they don't tell you that they're there. I think it's way less prevalent than it used to be. I think when this was a forum in 2010, 2011, 2012 I first came across it, I think it was probably a decent chunk but not the overriding majority. I don't even know necessarily that the people at the Flat Earth Society at that point really believed. I know that the flat earthers of the modern day think the Flat Earth Society were all fakers who never really believed it. I think the modern Flat Earth movement, the one that we saw putting up posters and adverts and writing research Flat Earth graffiti everywhere, they were people who really believed. And they were and I think part of the reason we know they really believed is because their arguments were so simplistic. There's no joy to be had, there's no fun to be had in saying it looks flat. There's sort of fun to be had in saying the world's accelerating upwards at the speed of gravity and the accelerating force of gravity, and we're approaching the speed of light. There's fun in that. But there's nothing fun to be had in saying, well, water doesn't stick to a ball. Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah.
If we focus on, there's a wider belief system within this community. If we focus on the flat earth aspect and admit the anti-vax side, are they actually, have you observed anything that they do that causes any harm to anybody?
Yeah, so in case anyone...
Repeat the question.
I was about to say, yeah, in case anybody couldn't hear, it was, have I observed anything that the flat earthers were doing outside of their other beliefs that it itself was harmful, outside of the anti-vax stuff? No, I mean, the flat earth itself, the flat earth belief itself is harmless, just believing that the world is flat. They weren't really doing a great deal of harm, but the problem is, the big caveat you put at the start was, setting aside all of the other stuff they believe. And unfortunately, it's very difficult, it's almost impossible to disambiguate the two. I remember when I was at the Flat Earth conference, there was a journalist there from the Times who was saying, oh, isn't this some remarkable fun? There's a guy pouring a glass of water over his head to show you that water doesn't stick to a round object. Isn't this hilarious? And I said, well, when you write about this, you can write it that way. But if you really want to know what's going on, you see the couple over there with the baby, go and ask them if they're going to vaccinate that kid. And if that kid takes ill tomorrow, are they going to go to a hospital and going to get some of that big pharma medicine that we've just heard is evil? Or are they going to try and treat it themselves with the stuff that this guy over there is selling? I think Flat Earth was a very prominent and prevalent entry point into some quite extreme ideas. I mean, the fact that they would casually throw around things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is deeply, deeply anti-Semitic, is the anti-Semitic document, and nobody bats an eyelid at that, suggests that while just believing the shape of the earth is different itself isn't harmless, it comes with all this other attendant stuff that really is harmful. And unfortunately, it will always tend itself towards anti-Semitism in this area, because you can't believe that something as big as the shape of the earth is being held from us without believing that someone is doing the holding. And if you start researching for who is hiding the great secret of reality, there's 200 or 300 years of people providing that answer, and providing lies about that answer to target particular people. So unfortunately, it's all going to drive in that way. It's also no surprise to me to see how many people that I know, that I saw in the Flat Earth movement, when COVID came along, were the anti-vaxxers in the streets who were then yelling abuse at doctors and going into hospitals and filming people and all that other kind of nasty stuff that came and is going to continue, unfortunately. So yeah, it in itself, in isolation, isn't harmful. Unfortunately, we can't isolate it. Yeah. Do you have another question? Oh, I'll go at the back of the room and then I'll come forward again. But yeah.
Yes, I see that you brought to our cognizance the Light magazine. Who exactly do you think is behind this?
Yeah, I mean, it's Darren Nesbitt. I mean, there's no. Have you come across the Light yourself? Have you seen it somewhere? Yeah, it's Darren Nesbitt, the flat earther that I mentioned. Oh, I've pressed the wrong button. The flat earther that I mentioned, Darren Nesbitt, is very specifically the editor. He started it. I've talked to him about it. I've interviewed him about the Light. I've been through lots of copies of it. I'm not sure if I can get back to it. I'll do this while I'm talking. But Darren Nesbitt started it, and the thing is, he's not making money out of it. When I give a whole talk, a second talk that I have about the time I spent undercover during COVID in the anti-vax movement with things like the Light paper, I will get there. And what a lot of people ask is, well, who's profiting from this? Does the editor make a load of money? This is the Light paper there. Does the editor make a load of money? And Darren Nesbitt has spent a decent chunk of his life savings on this. He's lost money on it. He gives it away for free. He just passionately believes in it. It unfortunately is I describe it as like a decentralized anti-vax campaign. It's not organized by anybody who's making a great deal of money out of it. It's just they genuinely think they're right. Unfortunately, it doesn't even just stay at anti-vax, because the vaccine came along. They said thousands of people would die, tens of thousands of people would die. They didn't die as a result. We aren't all dead. I talked to one anti-vaxxer who said 75% of the UK population will be dead due to the vaccine by the end of 2022. And I emailed him in January 2023, and I've not heard from him since. But they'll just move on to the next thing, and they'll move on to the next harmful idea. But yeah, Darren Nesbitt he's very open and transparent about it, and it's a sad thing. But they don't talk about the fact that he's a flat earther, and the people who really hand out this newspaper don't like you pointing out that it's edited and invented by a flat earther, because they recognise that kind of discredits them. I think there were two questions here. I'll go to you, then you, if that's all right. But
yeah, at the risk of introducing a new conspiracy, I'm interested that it's so linked with creationism. And when I looked into creationism, it's incredibly well funded, the Intelligent Design Foundation, things like that. There's a lot of money behind it. And it seemed to me that a lot of those arguments that were rehearsed, knocking down science in creationism, were then many of the arguments that were reused in climate denial. And it seemed to me that there is more than just, enthusiastic amateurs like this guy, that there is more happening around this than perhaps we might think.
Yeah, I think so. I think with the flat Earth movement in particular, there wasn't, and I think that the well-funded creationists didn't care about this, because they recognised this wasn't a useful political battle for them to fight. They were fighting on climate change. They're fighting on gay rights, women's rights, trans rights, abortion. I wrote a piece in for our magazine, The Skeptic, very recently, looking at how the evangelical movements in America are funding anti-abortion campaigners in the UK. If anybody saw the story of the lady it was a free speech story in lots of the newspapers. She was arrested for praying. I'm sure you saw this. I don't know if you realise that she was praying outside of an abortion clinic, having been told in the past that there was an exclusion zone there because people had been abusing patients and abusing the staff, and they said there's a certain number of yards. And when the police interviewed her on the street, they said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm praying." They said, "Is this a protest?" She said, "No." They said, "Well, could you do it somewhere else?" She said, "No, I have to do it outside the abortion clinic." It was the day that protest zone came into place. Her lawyers are provided by a creationist outfit in America. she did that protest on the day that ban came into place in order to test the law, and then paint this as a big freedom of religion, when really she was there and she stood there, I think, for 3 days before the police came, intimidating. And she can be silent doing it, but it's intimidating women who are going for abortions. It's intimidating the people who work there, who see this person shooting them daggers with their eyes the entire time. But her lawyers were provided by an American foundation. So, yes, there's a load of money in this, in the push against reasonable secular values, but they're not fighting this bit. They're putting their money into the stuff that, unfortunately, even secular newspapers would champion their cause because they don't recognise that it's essentially a weaponised and propagandised cause, essentially. Yeah. You had a question.
Yes, I'm just got to remember my question. Are most of these people men?
So the question was, are most of these people men? The Flat Earth movement did overwhelmingly skew male. I'm not quite sure why that was. It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was 100%. Certainly all the speakers were men, so the people who rise to prominence in those places are men. That might just be good old-fashioned misogyny. I mean, the people who rise to prominence in a lot of places are men, and that's because a lot of people don't want to hear from women because they're misogynists. The audience did have, I'd say it was maybe a 70-30 split, something like that. I think partly it's because at the time, the way that pseudoscience was targeted at society, it sort of splits down very socially regressive stereotypes, essentially. So the types of pseudoscience targeted at women are, well, you're a very caring, sort of nurturing type, and therefore it's alternative medicine-y type stuff and psychic-y type stuff. Whereas with men, it's like, well, you're a rational you're a logical, strategic thinker, so it's all engineering-y type stuff. And the arguments for Flat Earth would go more down that route. So I think it's not actually about anything about the difference between men and women, but about the way society stereotype men and women and things, yeah. Yes, I'll come there. If there's questions of it, I'll go next, but yeah, we'll do you.
I'm interested in the political links as well, that the far right seem to be very happy to align themselves with conspiracy theories. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yes, the question was around the political links between conspiracists and the far right, and how the far right are quite happy to align themselves with conspiracy theorists. During the pandemic, I mentioned briefly, I've got an entire talk that I do where I spent the time undercover in online spaces where anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists frequent. And what I noticed there was, if you go on Telegram, which is like a encrypted messaging platform where people will exchange these ideas, at the start of the pandemic, into those anti-vax spaces, there was a rush of far-right people, one of which, Tommy Robinson, was one of the most prolific anti-vaxxers in the country by April 2020, having never said a thing about vaccines by February 2020. Or, it's that kind of thing. And I think that's because he and his team and others like him recognise that when you have a disaffected group of people who are questioning, who are scared about what's happening, and the way that their fear manifests is to lead them to mistrust the mainstream narratives and to embrace these alternative narratives, those people are going to be hungry for anything that agrees with them. And if you're someone like Tommy Robinson, or when I was in those spaces, there were a lot of American white supremacist groups, like openly white supremacist groups, posting anti-vax misinformation into those spaces, because you recognise, if I say a few things these people agree with and leave a link back to my main channel, some of those people will say, oh, this makes sense, and I'm going to come across their main channel, and then you can drip feed them the more racist, hate-filled material that you have. And actually, give a spoiler for the talk that I give about the anti-vax movement, in that online space, I managed to get talking to the person who was the leader of the Liverpool anti-vax group, who was one of the leaders of the international anti-vax group, the biggest international anti-vax group. And after a while, we got talking, and I actually was able to have a conversation with him one-on-one for a while in the chat. And over a couple of months, he realised it was all nonsense and left. And he's actually a member of the Skeptics Society in Liverpool now. And he's like, I was just going through a bad time. This fit with a lot of my kind of preconceived narratives. And I asked him at the time, when he was still semi in the movement, you're a very progressive person. Why is your group so comfortable sharing stuff from Tommy Robinson? And he said, well, the thing is, we can't find anybody else who's saying the things he says that we agree with. All the stuff, like when we're looking for stuff that agrees with what we think about the vaccine, Tommy Robinson's saying it and other people aren't, so we have to use that. And I actually spoke to him recently. We did a panel at QED, the conference that I run. And he was saying he actually had a meeting with the other leaders of the anti-vax movement about how they could wean their group off Tommy Robinson and onto other more trustworthy sources. And I pointed out on the panel, you mean more trustworthy sources of anti-vax misinformation, though? Like, you weren't looking for more scientifically accurate, just ones who want white supremacists. So yeah, I think that's been an overt, intentional push by those extremist groups to recognise that they can weaponise people's fears, that there are a lot of people who have very reasonable fears around the pandemic, around the fact that they couldn't pay their mortgage overnight and all these kinds of things. Those people, they could be sold bad answers to complex problems and therefore be trained into accepting these extremist sources as a reliable source. And then when it comes to talking about the murder of some girls in Southport and what we need to do, they can be trained to go out on the streets of Southport and attack a mosque, even though the mosque had nothing to do with it. And I actually wrote a piece for the magazine actually talking exactly about that, about how when it came to the riots that we saw during the country, they were fed by the anti-vaccine conspiracy groups who'd been trained on this stuff for years by this point. Yeah. So she was saying it helps that you've told people not to believe anything. In particular, they demonise the mainstream media. And so if you train people to never trust the BBC or the Guardian or even the Mail or the Telegraph, don't believe any of that, only believe all these other alternative sources, like the Light paper, sources they control that have no verification, then anything that disagrees can be dismissed because it's just the BBC. It's just what the mainstream news would tell you. Yeah. Do we have a question else from? Okay, we'll go here.
Yes, you've drawn parallels, bad word to use in this case, between flat earthers, anti-vaxxers, creationists, and largely these movements are against what I could only call uncomfortable science. Do you ever see similar response to things like modern pure maths? Things like Riemann geometry and so forth.
Yeah, so the question was, these movements are set up against, what was the word you said about science? What?
Uncomfortable feeling science.
Yeah, uncomfortable feeling science. Do we ever see those kind of similar movements against things like pure maths and Riemann geometry? No, because they don't know those things. They may not know those things exist. They certainly can't understand them. The thing about the spherical Earth is you don't need to study it at a high level at university to understand that that's what people think the world is, because they would say the biggest proof that the world isn't really a sphere, that they want you to brainwash you about it, is you go into school and there's globes in the classroom. And that's because they want to indoctrinate you from a young age to accept that this is the shape of the world. Or you see the logo of the UN, or you see what used to be the BBC's ident was like a spinning Earth. Everywhere you look, there are spinning globes. And that's because they're trying to indoctrinate you and brainwash you. There isn't the same level of, from their side, attempted brainwashing about pure maths. I think a lot of people will go through their lives never encountering any pure maths or Riemann geometry or anything much more higher level. I think if those things were making tangible claims about their life, they may well have opinions on them. But like I said, their arguments are, it looks flat. So they don't need to go into much more complicated areas to find something to disagree with. Yeah. We'll go for, you can fight that amongst you to who asks first. Okay.
How do you get people out of that mindset, given that it's tied in with their identity?
Yeah, so the question, if you didn't hear, was how do you get people out of this mindset given it's tied into their identity? And I think partly it's to recognise that it is tied into their identity. It's to understand why is that. So first talk to people, whenever I talk to people in these movements, I ask them how they came to believe in this. Where were they when they first come across this? I don't want to debate flat earthers or have conversations about the minutiae of what shape, the water droplets are on a... What I want to know is, like, where were you when you first came across this? What was going on in your life on the way in? And then the other thing I'd say is, when it's part of their identity and you understand why, it's aligning around values, find common values. So when it comes to flat Earth, you might say, well, look, you distrust mainstream narratives. And I can tell you that there's lots of things I distrust that I'm told. I don't just believe everything the government tells me. Here's some examples of me questioning what the government says. But now that I agree with you that we shouldn't just accept everything we're told, I'm also going to say, should we just accept everything we're told by flat earthers? And so I try to reflect their values back on them. And it's about keeping in conversation. One of the things I often say is, if this is someone who's in your life who believes in something quite unusual, potentially even extreme and dangerous, You'll never deconvert them with an argument, and you'll never deconvert them overnight. But what you can do is to continue being in their life. The analogy that I use is when astrophysicists talk about the potential of an asteroid impact on the Earth. A catastrophic asteroid hits us, wipe out all life, what do we do? The Hollywood way of dealing with that is to send up Bruce Willis with a team of drills and nuclear bombs and blow the asteroid up. But actually you couldn't do that, because if you blew it up, it's still got all the same momentum and it's just going to rain devastation across the Earth. And that's what happens when you hit someone's belief in this head-on, big explosion. Like, you're wrong, here's why you're wrong, here's why I disagree, bang, big explosion, rain devastation across your relationship. Very, very hard for life to continue in that kind of way. When you talk to astrophysicists about how we would protect ourselves from an asteroid impact, one of the theories is you send up something with enough mass to hang around the asteroid to slowly change its trajectory using gravity, to slowly alter it, very slightly nudging, so the individual effect is very short, but very small, but over time it can slowly change the path it's on until before you realise it's not on a collision path anymore. And I think that's how you change someone's mind. Stay in their life, stay being an anchor towards reality, ask things gently here and there, bring up little challenges, but do it in a collegiate way. You're not trying to tell them they're wrong, you're trying to understand them. And when I try to understand you, when I try to follow what you're saying, I come across this issue. How do you get past this? Because you've clearly got past this. Can you help me understand this better? And if you do that, sometimes you'll find that the challenge you have is something they've never thought about because they've never had to confront it before. And because you're not bringing it up in a confrontational way, they don't realise they are confronting it. They're like, oh, well, and then they'll try and think it through, and they may find it doesn't work. They might never tell you, but it might just stick with them. So yeah, stay in someone's life, offer small challenges, stay being a supportive person, and also reduce the social cost of changing your mind. So if you make this such a big thing, people are like, well, look, even if I don't agree with it anymore, do I really want to have to do a massive climb down? It's much easier for me, the ease of my life is I'll just carry on. Even if I don't quite believe, I'll just carry on. I'll be like the priest who gave up his religious belief a long time ago but can't give up the job, because admitting you were wrong for so long is a very difficult thing to do. If we can take the weight out of and all the sort of the sting out of changing your mind, then I think people will be much more readily able to do that. So those are my piece of advice, essentially. You also had a question.
Yeah, my question is exactly the same one.
Oh, fantastic. Please tell me you're married and you disagree with each other, and you're on the different sides of the thing. Okay.
My different question, you mentioned 3% of the UK population has tendencies to believe it. Is it similar across the world, or there?
Did I mention that? I don't think I mentioned that. Oh, I see. I haven't seen that leaflet.
The YouGov poll
said
that in the UK, 3% of the population thought the world was probably flat, and another 4% weren't sure. That was a YouGov poll.
Yeah, I'm very dubious about those polls. One of the reasons, I'm very. There was a similar poll in America recently which found like a fifth of young people believe in anti-Semitic ideas, like genuinely believe that the Holocaust was fake. And actually, when you look at the polling methodology, there isn't a great deal of control. So I won't go into it. I do a lot of... I lecture at university occasionally on polling methodology. I think there's probably some rum stuff there. You get some people who just say the thing that they think is funny, because there's no comeuppance for doing that, especially if you're being paid to do so. You click the first button you see. But I would say that whatever prevalence there was, I suspect it's fairly consistent across the world. I've talked in Australia. I've met flat earthers in Australia. I give a talk in Brazil. I was there 1 week after the Flat Earth conference in Rio, which I'd have loved to attend, even though it would have been largely in Portuguese, there'd have been some English. I'd love to attend a Southern Hemisphere Flat Earth conference. So I bet none of their arguments account for the fact that they're in the Southern Hemisphere, because it's a Northern Hemisphere phenomenon, largely because it's English language. There may be parts of the world that are less prone to it. Like, there are parts of the world that are less prone to religiosity of the Flat Earth movement. I gave this talk in Prague, and I met the only 2 Flat Earthers I've ever met who aren't religious. From Prague. And I wonder, partly, is that because they're getting their flat earth beliefs from a non-English language area? They're not going first in English language, given that so much of this stuff came from America, from explicitly Christian sources, or even going back to the history, Rowbotham, Samuel Shenton, evangelical pastors to begin with, or creationists. But I also wonder whether in Prague these people were old enough to have grown up under the Iron Curtain when formalised religion was banned. And so there were a lot more atheists knocking around there because they were never indoctrinated into religion when they were young. So if they came across the religiosity aspects of flat earth, they may have taken the flat earth arguments but the religion's bollocks. So I think there's probably a similar prevalence of flat earth amongst most of the world, I imagine, or the same forces. I mean, people are people. But I think the religiosity is maybe variance depending on the background religiosity of the country. Yeah, back of the room.
If I understand you correctly, that you said that it's not as often screened now on YouTube.
Yeah, so the question was about, is it as prevalent on YouTube these days? So YouTube actually, when all this was kicking off in about 2017, 2018, YouTube started to remove flat earth content. If you put a flat earth video up, it was removed. These days they don't do that, but they've the moment's gone and people aren't being recruited to the movement. What I think doesn't happen for certain anymore is YouTube isn't recommending flat earth videos. Because for a while what it was doing was saying, oh, you've seen this video about the International Space Station. That's space related. This flat earth video is space related, so we'll just test the waters to see if you watch it. And if you did watch it because you thought it was ridiculous, YouTube's like, great, I'm going to give you another one of those. And then it would see that actually, when I recommend this video to people, they're watching it. So YouTube was recruiting people in that movement. They stopped doing that. People then, as flat earth fell, we saw the QAnon conspiracy theory rise. I think that was largely Facebook, but again, it was the algorithm. It was Facebook saying, you quite like this particular thing over here. You like this page. You're subscribed to this page. So what about this other busy page that there's loads of people talking about stuff in? It would prioritise pages that were very busy, lots of comments, things like that. And QAnon was having pages where people were saying, well, this is what the latest QAnon post is. If people don't know it, it was a hoax where the people claimed that they had inside information in the US government and was releasing it in coded ways. Well, people were spending ages trying to decode that, and there was lots of argument about the decoding of it on Facebook. And so Facebook would say, whatever this page is, there's loads of people talking about it, so we'll start sending people towards this. And Facebook recruited people into the QAnon movement that way. And so we actually see these tech platforms, the unthinking action of their keep you on the platform because I want to serve you ads was actively suggesting people to become more radicalized in these spaces. They occasionally put in markers to stop doing that, but I think recently Facebook started recommending that I join flat earth groups again, because it was a while ago that we got told off for doing that, so it was quite effective when we were doing it. It made us a lot of money, so we're going to carry on doing it. And I don't think they care about what the content is. So it's no longer anywhere near as prevalent. And I think it won't recruit people on YouTube anymore, because I think the people who are vulnerable to it have maybe seen enough people debunking and also ridiculing flat earth arguments that they will come in sort of pre-bunked, having already heard enough about it to not believe it. But I think that doesn't mean that it won't resurge again in several years' time when this kind of passes out the local memory, because we just see bad ideas just rise and fall. And we can see even as I was shown tonight, the same ideas coming up time and again across centuries have a powerful effect on people in the same kind of way. We're not any smarter than we were back then. At the front, and then I'll go to you afterwards, but we'll go here first.
I'm curious about the cosmic egg and the hollow earth. First I'm thinking he's curious to know what those are.
Okay, so he's asking about I mentioned two things I couldn't get to, which were the hollow earth and the cosmic egg. I'll start with the hollow earth. So the hollow earth, can I remember the guy's name? It may come back to me. It might not. When I first came across the flat earth, they had a podcast where they were interviewing someone who believed the world was hollow, which the earth is as we would accept, except there's a hole at the top and a hole at the bottom that you can go inside and walk on the inside of the earth, and then there's an entire world inside of there. He believed that there's heat inside the earth. That's not through geothermal stuff. That's because there's a small sun inside of the earth. And that's what causes all the plants to live and all of the people who live inside the hollow earth. And so when I interviewed this chap, I interviewed him, and Rodney Clough, that was his name. And we started talking about the hollow earth, and he's saying, lots of people have gone to the hollow earth. There was a Viking sailboat that claimed to have gone there. There was a sailor who came back, and he was drunkenly telling stories about the hollow earth, about the people he met down there. And it's like, okay, you don't think that was just a drunken sailor telling stories? You think that's true? And he said there was an Inuit tribe who were in a village, and then a disease ravaged that village. And when people came back to the village, there was no one there. And that's because they all escaped the village to escape the disease by going inside the earth. It's like, is there not a better explanation about why there was no one in this disease-ravaged village? But then he said to me, and of course the Nazis escaped to the centre of the earth after the Second World War. And I give lectures occasionally at university about how to interview people. And one of the things I say is, always pull the thread. If a thread comes up, always pull it. And I said, okay, the Nazis did that. Could you tell me more about that? He said, yeah, the Nazis, they went there in submarines, because they had submarines. Or some of the Nazis took spaceships that were given to them by the people from Venus. And they flew the centre of Earth and those. I was like, all right, but if the Nazis had spaceships from Venus, why didn't they use them to win the Second World War? Oh, they promised the people from Venus that they wouldn't. So, okay, but like the Nazis, famously, not good guys, probably break their promise. And he said, oh no, the Nazis weren't the bad guys. They were just defending Germany from Poland and Russia expanding. The Nazis were actually very badly done to in history, but they were the good guys. So, okay, this hollow earther is now literally a Nazi apologist. And I said, okay, but even if you thought that was true, surely the Holocaust, killing 6 million Jews, you can't just blame that on trying to keep out Russian expansion. He said it wasn't 6 million. So, okay, and now he's a Holocaust denier. And so, again, it's another illustration of how these ideas are all connected. Of course, when the flat earthers talked to the hollow earther, none of that came up. They just talked about how wrong everybody else was about the shape of the earth. And as for the cosmic egg was the evening talk on the Saturday night of the Flat Earth Conference was a guy called Martin Kenny. And he gave a 2.5 hour talk, and the first hour of it he was just explaining all the background research he's done into ancient mythology of like Atlantis and Hyperborea and Lemuria and all these kind of weird kind of mythological ideas. And he gave all of that next to something that was 6 foot tall under a giant sheet. And I think, let me see if I can pull up I have got the imagery in here, because I was desperate for him to show me what was under this sheet. I spent the entire time thinking, please show me what's under the sheet. And what he showed me was, will that work? Was this. So this is Martin Kenny. This is the cosmic egg model. He'd made this model out of like papier-mâché and plastic and things. And he was explaining that actually the world is a disk, but there's a centre of the Arctic Circle in the centre, and then water and land, and then a ring of ice around the edge. But beyond that ring of ice, more water, more land, more people. Then another ring of ice, more water, more land, more people. And there were domes on top of the Earth, but they were concentric. So there's one dome over us, and we live in the middle bit here. And he says, and every 20,000 years, I think it is, he spent 3 hours explaining this. It was great. It was so enjoyable. Every 20,000 years or something, the domes all recede, and we can travel between different areas of the world. We can different rings, different layers. And as we travel towards the centre, it gets closer to essentially heaven, essentially. And he believes that the Arctic Circle is actually very deep, like dense cloud, where the people who decide how things are going to be run and what next ring of Earth to release, they all live there. And so every cycle that all the domes recede, you can travel to there and sort of meet your maker, essentially. And he explained that each of these different domes has its own sun and earth. So the sun and earth sun and moon rather. The sun and moon of ours are obviously the sun and moon. Mercury and Venus are the sun and moon of the next dome. He was talking for so long that Mercury fell off and landed in the ocean because the lights on his model caused the stickiness to lose and sort of plunge into the ocean. But again, he was saying, and each ring, each different circle has its own race of people. And he said, that's where the different races of the Earth all come from. And the next ring that's coming, we know when it's coming. It's in the cycle. We know that it's a few centuries or fewer away from now. The race of people who are going to come next and rule the world for the next 20,000 years are the Aryan race. I'm like, oh God, did it have to keep coming back to that? So yeah, that was a different model of the world. That was the cosmic egg. 3 hours, honestly, deeply enjoyable. I think I wrote this up for either The Guardian or Gizmodo. It's on the Skeptic magazine on our website there, the cosmic egg. A remarkable idea. Yeah, he had a calendar and everything, like this big. Did I include a picture? I didn't include a picture of the cosmic calendar. It was bonkers, and it was because it was 3 hours long. I was at this point texting the Times journalist that I'd met, just jokes along the way because I was just having fun with it, and just had little silly jokes that I made, and he laughed and got thrown out, and I felt really bad. Do you have another question about anything?
Peter, you had a question.
Well, it wasn't so much a question. It was about you mentioned that many of these fat earthers are anti-vaxxers, but the point I was going to make is that most anti-vaxxers aren't flat earthers, are they?
No, they're not. Yeah.
In fact, some doctors are anti-vaxxers, which gives it a degree of respectability that it really should have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'd say, there is a straight line in terms of the people who were flat earthers would go through these other conspiracy theories. I think a lot of the people who marched on the streets and were threatening employees of the BBC and putting stickers everywhere were either people who were previously flat earthers or were people who previously would have become flat earthers but instead became this. You know, if this was happening to them then, like back then, they'd have become flat earthers. If you sort of see what I mean. If they were in the space that they were in when COVID hit, that made them become anti-vaxxers. If that was 6 years earlier, they may have become flat earthers. But yeah, absolutely right. There are then more senior people. You get people like Asim Malhotra, who is a cardiologist, who is also a very prominent anti-vaxxer, who I think and the Daily Mail seem to really like him, and they frequently publish articles in praise of him. He was the guy who also came up with a Mediterranean diet that was perfect for your heart health, called the Pioppi diet, based on a village in Italy that he went to, and it's exactly what they eat. But if you look at the diet, it contains no carbohydrates, but quite a lot of coconut. And so he was criticised at the time for being the only person who could go to Italy and come away with the idea that they don't eat carbs. You go to a place of pizza and pasta, and he was like, no, they don't eat anything like that. It's all coconut. But yeah, he's now a very prominent anti-vaxxer. And in fact, if you remember the politician Andrew Bridgen, who was radicalised during COVID and became an anti-vaxxer speaking out in Parliament, he talked about how the reason he recognised that the COVID vaccine was so dangerous is because he spoke to a very eminent cardiologist who explained the risks to him. And it was Asim Malhotra. So he's got quite a lot of power and sway, unfortunately. And he may end up in the next Trump administration, because he's certainly angling for a role with Dr. Oz and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. So we may well be shot at him soon, but he'll be America's problem, perhaps.
Well, I think we could go on forever, so let me just come up here.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
you can hear me. And I think this has been one of the best talks, don't you agree, that we've been to for a long time? Absolutely fascinating. You're a very highly driven guy, but so many people in your shoes would do what you don't, which is constant rebuttal and humiliation and making fun of them. And I think the fact that you go in and try and understand them as people and understand why they think the way they do is the best way, and I think it's a compassionate way. And you were talking about compassionate skepticism. Shropshire Humanists have a big interfaith action groups, and we meet with people of other faiths, and we don't challenge them, we don't ridicule them, we get to know them, and we find out what it is about their faiths that they find is good. They feel it makes them lead a good life and be a happier person, and their families and their communities. I mean, what's not to like? But we show them that we can achieve the same, but without religion. So I particularly value your compassionate attitude here. The 3 monthly Shropshire Humanist magazine is coming out in a couple of weeks, and there'll be an article about this, and I'll put in it references to various skeptical websites and so on, so look out for that. And I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed. I must confess that the humanist motto is think for yourself and act for everyone. And I've been thinking, and I think it looks flat. I'm sorry. So thank you very much indeed.